What do you think the key issue is now on the minds of the industry?
There's a lot of uncertainty. One of them, at the end of the day,
it had a little bit of a bearing on the stock market, I would say, over the past
the stock market, absolutely. The real estate market
right.
is, if you're going to buy real estate in 2 to 4 years, you better buy it under, and even when we bought, we turned into emotional wrecks, where all of the logic goes out the window, and I always like to have an intermediary party to keep the two sides from killing each other.
Yeah, I think that when the settlement happened and the new rules, it's been 2 or 3 months. It's been in the worst market we've seen in 15 years.
But I think that an agent is even more valuable than. The things that have made me the most wealth creation are not the ones I'm known for. It's actually.
I see where you're going with this. Yeah, it's always good to kick it with you. So we've went through the NAR settlement. We've went through now the election. We got New Year's coming up. The Feds just lowered the rates again yesterday, I believe it was. What do you think the key issue is now on the minds of the industry at this point?
Well, the key issue on the minds of the industry might be different than kind of the general economics, right? So I always find it interesting, like the Fed lowered the rate 25 basis points yesterday. That does not actually translate to a drop in mortgage rates.
Sure.
Right? Historically, mortgage rates are actually way more tied to the 10-year Treasury by about 150 to 200 basis point difference. What's been crazy is for the last couple of years, we're actually been 250 to 300 basis points, right? So if you look at the Fed rate and the 10-year Treasury, rates should be at 5%, 5.5%, and we're nowhere close to that, right? So,
based on the normal spread, historically.
Based on historical averages, but there's a lot of uncertainty. One of them was the election. Now, half the country's happy, half the country's mad, and it doesn't really matter, because I actually say, I don't think that has a bearing on the market. At the end of the day,
it had a little bit of a bearing on the stock market, I would say, over the past
the stock market, absolutely. The real estate market is human condition driven.
Yeah.
Right. We buy stocks because we have excess capital to invest and we feel confident in the economy. We buy cash flowing real estate because the deal makes sense from the interest rate you can buy it at and the cash flow it produces. It's not how we buy residential real estate.
Yeah.
We fall in love. We make little people. We need more space. We need less space. Couple promotions along the way. Death and divorce are 80 to 90% of transactions, right? Nobody says, all right, honey, rates are perfect today. Let's go buy a house. It's our lease is up in 60, 90 days. And do we want to continue to rent, or do we want to get on the property ladder? Or, hey, we've really outgrown this house with these 2 kids.
Why do you think that agents, I see a lot of agents on social media talking about, when the best time to buy a house is, or they act like the biggest question they get from consumers is, should we buy a house now? When really, do you ever really hear that question in the real world? Isn't it driven around what you're saying more?
So I think that is a fair question. Like, I grew up selling in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, which is a unique part of the country because every 4 years, people move in and out of the area. And so, as we just witnessed. So if somebody moves to DC and they're a young professional and they're with an administration, and this is a conversation I had many times in my life where it was like, hey, should I buy it? I'm like, well, how long are you going to be here? And they said, 2 to 4 years. If you're going to buy real estate in 2 to 4 years, you better buy it under an investment calculation, meaning the number I'm buying it for needs to cash flow in case I have to leave in 2 years. Because what you don't want to do is buy it, be underwater from an investment standpoint, and then you're upside down, and then you end up becoming a distressed seller. But if you're going to be in any area of the country, and the number that I historically have seen and would advise customers when I was an agent would say 10 years. If you are going to be in this general vicinity for 10 years, and you're spending X dollars on rent, and you can swap it for X dollars in mortgage, hands down 100% of the time, that is the right time to buy. Because first of all, you lock in affordability for 10 years, or 30 years actually. Your rent is not susceptible to your landlord increasing. And again, landlords can lower rates, but I still haven't seen that ever happen to me. Or I never lowered the rent on any one of my rental properties, right? I may have held it steady during a bad market, but I never lowered it. So you lock in that. And again, when I said 10 years is from experience of, look, if you bought a house in 2007, like May of 2007, depending on where you lived in the country, that was like the worst month in history of America to buy a house. And even if that property dropped by 40, 50%,
You're still up right now.
if you go to 2018, you were okay. You could at least get out of it. So there is a wrong time to buy based on your horizon. So if you bought because you could afford to buy, but you looked at that on a cash flow basis, and for what you could charge in rent for versus what you could afford to pay, you're upside down $500, $800, $1,000 a month. And there is a high probability that you may no longer live there in 2 years. I actually talk people out of buying.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's something that the market overlooks is the fact that when you lock in a mortgage, you're not susceptible to rate increases, which is what you just talked about. That's the one thing a lot of these guys talk about. Go rent. Home prices are too high, interest rates are too high. Go rent. And I'm thinking, well, you're going to pay more every year. You're going to pay more every year. To me, it just doesn't make sense. Even if you lock in a little higher than what your rent is, when you look at, like you say, a 10-year period, you're going to be in way better shape. And then you got equity and everything else. Speaking about real estate agents, right? We had the election, we had the settlement, right? We're past all that, and you were we talked about it. You were in the forefront of, leading the charge with the brokerages on how we should handle the buyer broker commission and stuff like that. Speaking about that for a second, like the way I see it, not a lot has changed since all this came into effect. We've got through the election, all this stuff. We talked about the industry buyers and sellers. What are agents worried about now? What's the next thing? Because it seems like they got to have something to worry about at all times.
Well, in fairness, I've been in the business for 23 years, and there was always some life-changing event.
Right.
I got into the business right after 9/11, and so that was very scary. And then we had the greatest run-up in history where, I feel like the multiple offers in 05, 06 were worse than...
They were. They were absolutely
Because there was no income, everyone qualified.
Right.
So everyone was a qualified buyer. So that was historically very difficult to operate in.
I mean, there were 7 million transactions in 05, I believe, versus 6 million in 2021.
So very close, but the part that people don't add is that there was less humans. Right. So
no, I get that. I mean, that's part of my point.
Exactly.
It's like there was more transactions with less people and less homes, right? There's been a lot of homes built since then.
So then we had the worst crash in the history of the world. And then it recovered, then we had COVID. So there's always some, major catastrophic
For sellbyowner.com, right? Real estate agents are done.
Yeah.
Zillow is going to take your job. Zillow is going to take over. They're going to replace real estate agents. AI is going to replace real estate agents.
And so that's probably the more common one I'm hearing now, right? When I do Q&A, it's like, is AI going to put us out of business? And this is what I fundamentally believe. I believe that in Ricky and Leo's functional career lifetime, there's going to be a need for a real estate agent, right? First off, it's highly infrequent. The average number of times people bought and sold real estate when you and I got in the business, because I remember from another conversation, you and I started pretty much the same time, was 7 years. That number has slowly creeped up to 9 to 10 years.
Over what period? Like when was it 7 years and when?
Yeah, so in the early 2000s, it was about every 7 years people moved. Now it's getting closer to every 9 years people moved.
What do you think is the cause of that?
Yeah, no, that's what the data says. It's partial rate lock, right? Like the average interest rate in America for 84% of all Americans have a sub 5% interest rate, right? So even if you found a house that was equal to or greater than, to swap a 3% rate for a 6.5% rate, that takes out a huge portion of the potential sellers. So people are just holding on to homes longer. We're living longer. My father's 83 and he can probably outrun both of us, right? He's just in really good shape. That didn't used to happen 20, 30 years ago, right? So people are aging in place a lot more gracefully. So they're like, I don't need to move to a condo or a retirement community because I can still mow my lawn, I'm still healthy, I'm still, So the length of ownership is extending, which takes housing inventory away, right? Because we're not building enough homes. People aren't choosing to sell them at the same pace. So, but that adds to the reason why I think we need agents for a long time, right? If I do this only but every a decade, Well, whatever you did when you bought the house is completely different. First of all, you probably signed paper 10 years ago. It's funny to say it out loud, right? Like paper, blue ink, maybe a fax machine. Now everything's digital, DocuSign, electronic. And so the need for help, so one is the average American moves 6 times in their entire life. 3 as a tenant, 3 as a homeowner. And it's typically your starter home, your move up home, your move down home. If you think about that, that's very infrequent and it turns into very emotional, right? Like it's not like buying a cash flow property or picking an office where it's like, okay, does this have enough square feet?
It's a big deal.
This is like, and I think you can relate to this. Like I, as an agent, transacted like close to 4,000 properties. I haven't lived in that many homes with Ariana and the kids. And even when we bought, we turned into emotional wrecks where all of the logic goes out the window. And I always like to have an intermediary party to keep the two sides from killing each other.
Yeah. Speaking of people hanging on to their homes longer, right, and that like messing with the inventory and stuff, what are your thoughts on this whole, people having less babies, population slowly going to dwindle over the next 100 years. We're going to have empty buildings and stuff in the next, century.
It's a very real, like again, I'm a data nerd, well-known phenomenon that when you go from a third world to a first world to an industrialized country, the higher the standard of living goes, the more expensive it is to live. Having kids is more expensive in a first world, highly industrialized country than a emerging third world country. And there's actually a very good example of what not to do, and it's called Japan.
Yeah, they have empty.
In the US, we have roughly 94, 95, 96 million residential places we can put people, including rentals, apartments, single family. We're short like 4 or 5 million. That's why prices haven't come down, even though rates shot up to 8%. Everyone thought the market was going to collapse.
And that's due to the creation of new families that need homes,
so that ingredient is called household formation, which, by the way, ours is still going up, which is a really good thing. And it could either be one of 2 ways. One is birth rates, also immigration. Right. So as long as there is more,
we don't have any problem with that, I don't think, right this second.
No. But again, but if you look at Japan, they had a very closed philosophy, and now they have 60.
Where they just don't let anybody in the country, basically.
Correct.
And then did they also have a
replacement of baby problem?
Right.
So their problem is so exacerbated now that they have 68 million.
And why do they do that? Do you know?
I'm not part of that economy, but this is the interesting one. 68 million places to put families in, like apartments, rentals, single families. There's only 60 million households. So it started more in the rural areas, and now it's actually even going into inner cities.
So you're saying there's 68 million homes available with 60 million people?
With 60 million households, families.
Households.
So there's 8 million vacant
empty homes.
So we're short 4 million. They have in excess. We're short 4 to 5 million, depending on the economist you ask.
We have empty homes in our country, right?
But there's still an excess of owner.
Excess of primary. Like we have empty homes, but we have an excess of the amount of households needed.
Correct.
Versus they have an excess of homes, less the households needed. Got it.
Big distinction.
Yeah. So the election's over. The stock market went crazy. What do you? I mean, you can't predict anything. What's your feeling for next year when it comes to housing?
So I've made predictions, so I'm going to stick to them.
Okay.
So
I didn't know if you're a prediction guy. Some people don't like to do predictions because they don't want to be wrong. And then
in the last, I think that's a choice you make, both in leadership and then being public by being on social like you are. Look. Sometimes
I like predicting, and I don't care if I'm wrong.
Sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're wrong. That's the fun thing about predictions. So, like last year, so October of 23, I got up on stage in front of 6,000 people. I said, "This is my prediction." I said, 23 will be a copy paste of 24.
23.
Or 24 will be a copy paste of 23.
Of 23, yeah, which it was basically.
Basically, right? Yeah. So we sold 4 million resales with 600,000 new construction. We're on pace to do 3.9 million resales with 700,000 new construction.
We're right in line.
So
a little more inventory, but right in line as far as sales, pending deals, etc.
So 23, 24. So the prediction that I'll go on record with, because I've already gone on record, so is if nothing crazy changes, so I'm assuming the rates, like I even made this prediction before yesterday's cut, but let's just assume it stays relatively flat. Because the difference, if you look at January 1...
mortgage rates stay flat? Are you saying?
They actually bumped up a little bit after the election. But
what
again,
are you saying stays flat? 10-year Treasury, mortgage rates, Fed rates?
Let's just assume they all hold.
Okay, they all hold.
Which, by the way, there's room to naturally float down without any cuts.
With the spread of the 10-year Treasury, of course.
But let's just assume it holds flat. If you look at where rates started Jan 1 to November 1, they've already come down quite a bit, right? So at today's affordability, with, as you pointed out, the newer inventory, so we're up like 34% year over year on inventory.
Which is that even back to pre-pandemic levels? It's not.
It's still
we're still lower than pre-pandemic.
We're like 20% lower.
Yeah.
But again, it's better than we've had, right? So if all holds as it is today, that's the prediction I'm making, we should get about a 10% bump in transactions for 2024. So 4 million plus 600,000 or 3.9 plus 700,000, you add 10% to that, we should end up breaking the 5 million if you add
with new construction.
So low 5 million.
I normally look just at existing home and gauge it there.
And the reason why I bring it up is because in 2024, 20% of all sales will be new construction, which is substantially higher than average. Average is between 10 and 15%.
And that's because mortgage rate buy downs and all the incentives the builders are giving. You're getting a new home. You basically can get it cheaper than an existing home, etc.
So builders did a couple of smart things over the last 24 months. One is they actually shrunk the footprints.
Made the houses smaller.
They did shrinkification like we've seen other parts of the economy do, where it's like, hey, we don't need to build as much house, but it's still new, and I can get you into this for $450, $500, whatever price point your market bears. In some parts of the country, it's equal to resale. So it's like, why buy resale when I can buy brand new?
Lower rate.
And the third one is exactly what you said. It's that buy down rate. And again, I think for any agent listening, they should be educating their sellers that is a tactic to get the house moved quicker. Be like, hey, like I recently saw a product that was interesting. It's newer, but a third of outstanding mortgages technically are assumable because they're govy of some sort. And so there's a startup trying to identify those properties where, again, it's tricky because let's say you have a first deed of trust with the VA at $400,000, but the house is worth $700,000. Technically, based on the underwriting, you could assume that mortgage, but you have to come up with $300,000, right? You're not doing 10, 20% down.
Right.
Because most of the people who captured a really good rate did it 3 years ago. So the equity's gone up quite a bit. And so,
but those assumable loans are tougher right now with the equity.
With the equity, but they're phenomenal.
They're phenomenal.
If you could get a 2.85 30-year fix with 26 years left on it, that's gold.
And these are FHA, VA, USDA. And when you do that, the seller that you're assuming it from, can they go get another government loan, or
as I understand it, if it's approved and accepted by the underwriter,
they can go get another VA loan or whatever.
Yeah, because they get their certificate back.
Oh, that's interesting.
But again, I think that's still just like a niche, right?
Right. Have you heard how builders are handling this commission thing? Like, are they still offering? Are they offering a lot? Are they offering a little?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about all of it in general, it's hyper-local, right? So like, imagine in the position I sit, I have agents in certain parts of the country. Now, I won't name states to leave the innocent alone, but there are some states that literally have one take on it, and then there's other states that have a completely different take on it. So it's super interesting because I'm in certain masterminds with our top performers, and that we'll have two folks who are losing their mind, going, "This is so complicated. We're having so much conflict," and then we have other top producers in another part of the country like, "What are you talking about? This is super simple. You just use this form and it's straightforward." And I have to remind them, I'm like, guys, you guys have different forms at the state level, not just like the forms we create, but like the purchase and sale contracts. Like one association, and I will name them by name because I think they did such a great job, the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, their page 1 of the sales contract almost reads like a net sheet. There's a purchase price, there's percentage financed, there is it literally says seller to credit buyer, so closing costs, buy down points, Then right below it says seller to pay buyer brokerage compensation.
Very clear.
And then one sentence underneath it says, this is a binding legal agreement between the seller and the brokerage to be amended only in writing. Like, if everyone used that as the purchase and sale contract, there is no questions.
It's like the old napkin contract.
It doesn't matter what I'm offering you. It doesn't matter what we're advertising. It's like, look.
It matters what the offer is right in front of us and what we're going to net.
This is what the buyer and I agreed to pay. The buyer requested that to be paid by the seller. Mr. and Mrs. Seller,
what do you want to do?
What do you want to do?
What do you want to do?
So, I mean, I actually, good question. There was a thread inside of our internal communication thing where this agent asked the question. I actually logged in and responded myself because she's like, look, I'm so confused. Like, what if I have a first-time home buyer who needs down payment assistance and needs all this stuff? What am I to do now? I said, you are to show them all the properties available, and it's up to the seller if they want to sell it under these terms. This is no different pre-August 17th. If I was doing down payment assistance and needed 6% contributions for buy down points, because that's the only way my buyer qualifies. No one's forced to take any offer they want.
Right.
And what I say to agents all the time is like, have you ever not gotten anything for below list? Have you ever not gotten a pool table, a hot tub, the refrigerator in the garage,
the boat, car? I've seen all that happen.
I remember going to a Brian Buffini event and he told me he got a dog once.
I think I remember that speech.
I don't know if it was a script, but I remember it 23 years later. Okay. Right? It's considered personal property. It's legally conveyable. I mean, people buy cattle and farmland. And they get farm equipment. Like, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law moved to Florida a couple of years ago, and they had the beautiful house in Northern Virginia. And my brother-in-law is really handy, and the basement's like the most beautiful thing of the house, but he had a detached sauna with a plug, and he had a sign on it that says does not convey. They ended up with like 14 offers. It escalated $100,000 over a list. They got the sauna. Right. It literally said not included.
It's like when you put it in the contract. Okay, you put it in the contract. The seller, we negotiate the deal, and in the contract, the seller says as is, right? Will not do repairs. Okay, real capital letters, right? And every single time, and I mean, I'll tell the seller, like, we're gonna put it in there, that way they know, but they're gonna come back after the inspection and they're gonna have a list of stuff for us to repair, and they're gonna submit it to us just like you didn't even say that, and you're gonna probably end up doing some of them because you want the deal to work.
And if there's a contingency for inspection only, they still have the right to walk. Right? So it's like, you can say, and because I had the same conversation with sellers, it's like, it's as is where is. Okay, but if I agree to a 5-day inspection with a release clause, right? You're open for negotiation. So that's how I feel about this compensation conversation. I think people overcomplicate it, right? It's like, if the seller doesn't want to accept the offer as presented from the buyer, because that's the distinction. It's not about Leo the agent, Ricky the agent. It's about the buyer and the seller, the net proceeds the seller is going to walk with, and the net proceeds the buyer can afford to bring to the table while affording the monthly payment.
I'm starting to lean towards a place where I think this is the new norm, where the buyer's agents offer what they want in the contract and the seller pays it based on their net. Do you ever think we'll get to a place where the buyer is paying it and the sellers do not contribute at all in the offer or whatever?
So I would say that that's always been the case. The seller doesn't have any contribution. They have equity, right? The buyer, whether it's fully financed, paid in cash, that is where 100% of all the funds are coming from. So I would make the argument that whether it's from the cash contribution or the finance contribution or the credit from the seller, at the end of the day, the buyer can afford what the buyer can afford on a monthly payment with X amount of dollars to be contributed in cash, with Y amount of dollars to be contributed from the loan. And so I think sometimes we overcomplicate and are splitting hairs. And it's like, look, if my seller's qualified for $400,000 and they have $50,000 in cash, and they're qualified for this LTV, this is what they can bring to the table. This is what they can bring to the table. And if the seller's willing to accept, the net that brings them after compensation credits and whatever else prepays on the because remember, that buyer can ask for, as long as it's approved by the lender, for an 8% credit to buy down the rate to a rate they can afford. The seller doesn't have to accept that, but are they willing to accept it for a price they're willing to walk away with a net they're willing to walk away from? And so That's how I see the world. I don't think much changes.
Yeah.
In the sense of, at the end of the day, this is your net for the seller, and at the end of the day, this is the net that you need to bring to the table as the buyer, and that's all that matters at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think that when the settlement happened and the new rules, it's been 2 or 3 months. It's been in the worst market we've seen in 15 years. And so it's maybe a little misleading and it's brand new against a 40-year model we've had. It's going to take time to unwind. I guess the only fear I have is if we get back into a 2021 or 2003 market where we're getting tons of multiple offers, people offering more than asking price. The seller picking the offer that doesn't ask them to pay for a buyer agent fee.
So this is, and again, this is just an opinion right now because we're not in that market.
Sure.
But I think that an agent is even more valuable then.
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
Right? So.
But if the seller's looking at their net and they're saying, well, this one doesn't have an agent, and or they're not, the buyer may be paying their own agent on those deals, right? It's not saying there's not an agent. It's just saying that the seller isn't.
But so back to those days, right?
It's still cash that the buyer.
The seller is, the buyer's probably having to contribute above the appraised value. And they're like, it goes back to what I just said. Total cash contribution from the buyer, total net cash to the seller. Those are the only two.
And in those
problems.
markets, like some buyers can't compete. Well, they're not going to be able to compete even in the old market at that point. If there's 10 offers, it's going to kind of be the same scenario.
And in a market where there's 10 offers, I think that's where good realtors show their value proposition, right? Like, I remember winning in those markets as an agent because
Fun, wasn't it?
Well, it was just, I asked a lot more questions to the listing agents. Like, hey, what's the seller doing after this? And they're like, oh, well, we're waiting for this to be built. I'm like, hey, what if I gave you a 30-day free rent back? Like, on a well-sized priced home, that's meaningful. I'm saving you $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 in monthly payments, and depending on what day we close, I could almost contribute 2 months of a free rent back without my buyer having to put anything out of pocket, because we closed on the 5th of the month and it was prepaid escrow, and so you basically got 60 days. If I could say to the seller, hey, I'll let you live in the house for 2 months while your home is being built, and you put the cash in your pocket so you can close on your next home with a lot of confidence. All of a sudden, that 10 or 20K above list is a lot less interesting, because it's like, wait, how about I close in 10 days, give you all your proceeds, and let you live in the house for 60 days so you can close on your next home. You have small kids. I don't want to rush you. All of a sudden, it's like, I want that offer. And that we didn't have to go above list. I just asked questions that were important to you. Because when you're doing the sell to buy and you're worried about basically being in a truck with your 2 kids and your partner, that gets very scary.
Yeah.
And as an agent, you probably experienced it where a loan got delayed and then you had to put them up in a hotel and
moving trucks in there.
So that's what a good agent brings to the table.
Yeah.
Where they can ask these questions and say, okay, how can I make us really be set apart from the other 10 offers and get you something that's still a fair deal to you that you can afford with the concessions you can bring to the table.
This was in 03 or so?
Yeah, like 2006, 7, all that.
Well, back in I lost everything in 5. I went back to roofing houses, serving tables and stuff, working on oil rig, and in 2008, I got back in the business, and it was all foreclosures. And I thought, let me represent the bank. It was like, after a minute, I was like, no, that's not my route. I'm going to represent buyers to buy these foreclosures at half off, and then they'll resell in 3 years when it goes up, refer me, upgrade, and all that stuff. But do you remember, I don't know if you were reselling in 08?
I was selling REO. I was one of the biggest REO agents.
You were the listing agent.
I was the listing agent.
This is funny because in 03 and 02, when you were talking about that, I was on the listing side of all those, right? All the multiple offers was coming in. I was on the listing side.
I was the buyer's agent back then.
Right. So you were the buyer agent, I was the listing agent. But then in 08, you were the listing agent, I was the buyer agent, right? We flipped.
I'd carry 250 listings, right? Yeah. Like, my job was to do price reductions and property management.
and do you remember, obviously, the multiple offers during that time?
Yep.
Now, that people don't talk about that. 08, the worst year, the big crash and all that stuff. Like, I was winning bids, and for that, there's no what's more important to the seller is the bank, right?
Well, As soon as possible in cash.
Right. So it was literally whatever the you had to have the highest number. So you had to kind of guess, and you didn't have no idea. You had no idea. It was a blind bid. You had no idea what that number was going to be.
But there was a period there where like I'd carry properties. It was 18 months of inventory in the market, right? Like back then the buyers were the better thing to have because you had the pick of the litter.
Sure. But I wouldn't have minded having 250 listings.
No, I didn't mind either.
But it was a lot of work. It's not your normal listing, right? They make you maintain the property.
It was called cradle to grave, right? So we took it back from repossession all the way through proper capitalization. So we had to fix everything, get it completely market ready to closing. So it was cradle to grave.
Until death do us part. I didn't want nothing to do with it. But I knew that a lot of those agents wouldn't exist later because they did not answer their phone. I would call those foreclosure agents and they would not answer. All of them. They were notorious. They just would not answer. And I was like, okay, you want to play that game? I'm gonna represent all these buyers. My business is gonna continue to grow, and you guys are gonna be gone as soon as foreclosures are gone. Do you agree or do you believe in pent-up demand?
So I believe in numbers, right? Our household formation, so right now, every day, 12,000 Americans are turning 35 years old.
Well, that's one of my big theses around this because it's record, right? I mean, the baby boomers were more, correct? Right? There was more of a, and it's weird because like, I look at the birth rates and I see the baby boomers, right? And then it goes down for like 20 years, and then I see the spike in 1990, but it's nowhere near the baby boomer years, but yet there's way bigger population than...
Well, so the baby boomers made the millennials, right? Like I'm the first, what year were you born?
81.
So you and I are like the first millennials.
Yeah,
so we're
the oldest millennials in the world.
We're called geriatric millennials, I heard the other day. I was like, I'm not sure I like that. But so, I mean, and our parents were boomers. So technically that's why you...
When were you born?
82.
82.
That's where we have the big population booms. But, based on what I look at in both household formation, people turning the right ages to buy real estate, if rates come down and we had enough inventory, we could have 6 million transactions.
Oh, no doubt.
We just don't have enough inventory that people can afford.
Well, my question is this. More 30-something-year-olds than we've had in a while. I saw NAR came out with their data that the age of first-time home buyers went up to 38. Trade-up sellers, there's got to be pent-up demand in there. People
absolutely.
Wanting to move up, hating their house every day that goes by.
But they love the rate.
Now you've got people that have been sitting on the sidelines because of rates and the elections. Like, I feel like this is like a tsunami. That's it's like the calm before the storm. You're talking about transactions increasing 10%. We're still below pre-pandemic levels in terms of inventory, right? Isn't this going to cause home prices to increase?
It could. And what I always say, it's hyper-local, right? So we had boom towns like Austin, Texas, Boise, Idaho, parts of the west coast of Florida, Naples, that did and South Florida did too, but the demand is still present in South Florida. But there are markets that were like this, who are now starting to, it's not 08 crash. When you and I think of a crash, we think of, you and I saw 50% market drops. You said 50 cents off. That's what I experienced.
It was. We had we were 50% off.
There's homes that I sold for $350 that I then did as an REO for $150. It was I never thought I'd see that. I still can't comprehend that.
And you were still scared to buy it for $150, right? I saw that and I was still scared to buy it.
It's going to go to 100.
Yeah.
Right? Where I started buying, where I actually did the math and I'm I'm at 12% cash on cash.
The cash flow made sense.
At some point I was and I actually remember having this conversation where it was I bought a house and flipped it for 180. My comp said 180 and I ended up selling at 150. And I went back and looked at my comps. I'm my comps were perfect. But I was all right, if I just held it at 150, it was $1,500 a month. So it was the 1% rule. And I said to myself, if it goes to zero, which it can't, but let's just, in my head, I was and I held it for, it was 18 years or something. I was I'll get all my cash back. So it really doesn't matter if it goes, there was a number that if it went below, I actually didn't care because the cash flow, I could fully capitalize it and get it back and get all my cash flow back. And luckily I did buy a bunch of real estate.
Yeah, me too. What was interesting in 08 was rents didn't really go down much.
No, and this is actually, I remember I had a mentor who unfortunately passed away last year, but he was really important to me. who was a big owner.
My mentor that was really important to me passed away a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, mine actually passed away the day before EXPCon Canada. But he owned a lot of real estate. And I remember, like, I'll never forget this. I was driving around in 08, 09 with him, just looking at all these houses, because that's who I convinced to fund my buy and acquisition, because I didn't have too much liquidity, obviously, because you and I were on the younger side of that market cycle. But he told me, he's like, the beautiful thing about residential real estate, and that includes multifamily, is that it stores human beings. And he gave me an example. He said he had bought data centers in the late 90s. And we forget there was a
data centers.
Yeah, like where you put the GPUs, and like where Amazon Web Services has all their stuff. And in the late 90s, we forget there was a huge economic crash after the dot-com boom. And he actually had warehouses that sat empty for years, like 2-3 years, because he told me, he's like, I couldn't have lowered the rent to zero. There was no demand for warehouses after the dot-com boom. Like, there was excess capacity for data centers. He goes, in residential real estate, as long as we don't have the Japanese problem,
right?
If your rents are $1,800, there is a number at which that'll rent.
Right.
Well, and again, even in South Florida, I've seen rents come down in the last 24 months because they went they went parabolic.
Like you say, it's local.
But like, there are real estate, commercial, office markets right now. It doesn't matter what you put it up for rent.
It's not going to rent.
Like tertiary, or like, I wouldn't want to own office space, commercial office in San Francisco right now, right? Or like even Austin right now. There was such a pullback, right, where it really doesn't matter how much you lower it. There's no demand. There's no demand.
Yeah.
Versus in our functional lifetime, and I would go back 50 years, 100 years. As long as, look, there's a rental number in residential that you can adjust to, and we know this to be true when you see a brand new apartment building open up. What do?
Rent quickly.
2 months rent for free.
Oh yeah.
Right, and they lease up the whole building.
Right.
They maintain the number they want, but they'll give you a 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 months incentive.
So they incentivize to keep that rent where it needs to be.
But then it's fully rented.
Then it's it. That's where it is.
That's where it is.
They've got history now.
then that's where it is.
Yeah.
So
I'm building an apartment complex, 46 units. So I'm glad you said that.
Right, because you'll probably hire a professional management company, because 46, you'd have to live in the building, right, and have an office, which I know you're not going to do. But once it's fully stabilized, the rents really maintain themselves based on that supply demand.
Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss, and
you too.
And you're right. We were on the younger side when that cycle happened, and thank God, because there were 40, 50, 60-year-olds that were going through the same thing I went through in my mid-20s during that time.
I was 23. I gave back 14 properties to the bank. I had to do short sales on a lot of them because I thought I was very special, and I wasn't. I had a heartbeat, and I qualified a mortgage debt that I shouldn't have qualified for because I was buying way over leveraged real estate. In hindsight, right, I wasn't worried about cash flow. I thought everything was going to keep going up and to the right, and I am grateful. I feel it was like the Goldilocks age, right? We were old enough to be able to participate, and when you lose it all at 23, you could still cry and feel bad for yourself. But I didn't have a partner and kids to look in the eye and worry about how I'm going to feed them, right? Because I always said, when you're 23, I mean, you could sleep here, and I could live on my friend's couch, my mom's basement. Like, you could live anywhere and get back on your feet versus losing all at 55 or 60 with children and college tuition and all kinds of things that are in your hindsight.
Yeah. What time is it?
We're good. 2:45.
Okay. We talked about this. You know, you've done so many things. You're an agent, and you built a tech company and sold it. That was a huge exit, right? It's like a 9-figure exit.
It was a big one. It's under NDA, but it was a big number.
Right. And you know, I mean, you're set, but you decided, I'm going to go be the CEO of a publicly traded company. It seems like a lot of people would think that, like, why would you do that to yourself?
First of all, the interesting thing is, like, the things that have made me the most wealth creation are not the ones I'm known for. It's actually buying real estate. It was hard money lending and creating revenue streams, right? So I think sometimes people don't realize that the most guaranteed ways to build wealth are the non-sexy and slow, right? Like the beautiful thing about buying real estate is it's that self-liquidating function that comes with debt, right? Like, let's pretend the values never go up.
Right.
But if somebody else pays off your mortgage, and you have the discipline to not sell it, that's actually one of the best.
That's a huge win right there.
And you know, when Ariana and I, my wife, started the software company, and we were able to fund that from our real estate business. We were able to, you know.
Would you take out equity loans?
No, just the cash flow of our team and the real estate we had bought over time, which is very different, right? It's fascinating to me how many startup founders I meet who are like, they just need to raise all this money. It's like, hey, the first thing is if you create even a small business, an SMB, that creates enough cash flow to fund your ideas, there's a lot of discipline that comes with finding product market fit from cash flow, right? Because we just lived through an era where there was lots of money raised for ideas that didn't really pan out because there was cheap money available, right? Like the Vision Fund and all the people writing these checks for businesses that we could arguably look at and go, really? I'm not sure I see that pencil out. So,
you think there were some that you didn't think would pencil out that crushed it?
That's a good one. No. More of the ones like, we're surprised that didn't work. That didn't look like it was going to work. Look, Uber worked only because they were able to burn through so much cash, right? So now it's a real cash flowing business.
Yeah.
But they needed billions of dollars to get there. And again, that's a strategy that isn't available to most people. But to your original point there was, you know, I think we're never done, right? And I think there's a romantic idea of like, hey, when I get to this, I'm gonna just kick up my feet and what are you gonna do, right? We moved to South Florida. I was mostly spearfishing. I got really good at spearfishing.
With snorkeling or the tank and everything?
Tank and everything.
Wow.
But after 6 months, it's like, I literally started thinking, I'm like, am I going to buy the charter and like turn it into a business and scale it all up and down the East Coast? Because that's how my brain works.
Thinking, yeah.
But I got a call from a mutual friend who introduced me to Glenn. And Glenn actually asked me if I wanted to be the chief technology officer because I have a tech background. And I said, I can play one on TV, but I don't actually like it that much. I like selling, but I said, I'll probably just start another company. And he said, well, do you have the idea? And I said, no, I'm actually a little burnt out. It was the hardest thing we've ever done, just because of the traveling and the raising capital and scaling and running a bigger organization. And he said, well, if you don't have the idea, why don't you come hang out with me? I have a little company that became a big company, and I have all these things to fix. And I heard you're good at that. And basically Glenn's pitch was come hang out for like 6 months. And he goes, when you get the next idea, we can either buy that company and you can, I can be your partner in it, or we can, if you get an idea and you raise a round, I'd love to contribute. And so, by the way, he's a better salesperson than most people realize, because it was like the perfect thing to say to me.
Perfect pitch.
To me.
Yeah,
it was highly tailored, because it was like, how could I say no? It was like, oh, you just want me to hang out?
No wonder he's where he's at. Wow.
And so he's like, just come hang out here. And then, he's like, come up with a title that makes sense. It doesn't have to be very public facing, because I was at the company longer than most people knew me. And then 6 months in, he's like, hey, I heard you're touching this, that, and that, and this, and this, and that. And I was like, yeah. He's like, well, you're kind of running the business, so I'm going to give you a different title. It's called be Chief Strategy Officer, where you basically, his words were, you can be the shadow CEO, but I'll stay in the front, so you don't have to be out front. And I was like, that's because I actually said to him, I was like, I'm actually having fun being the fun uncle versus dad, because my entire life I've been founder and CEO. And 6 months later into that, he goes, okay, I'm ready for you to be CEO. And I was like, I'm having fun. Like, this works. Like, you keep the title, I'll just do me in the background. And then 6 months later, he tried it again. I was like, it's good. We don't need to mess with anything.
It's not broken.
Yeah, and that was December. And then March 18th happened, or March 15th. And then that was the day of the NAR announcement. Then that Monday, March 18th, is when I went live on YouTube and felt like what it was like to be Ricky Carruth for a day. I had 53,000 concurrent people show up, and I got very loud. And And then by that Sunday, he called me. He's like, "You are the CEO." I was like,
Right.
"Let's have a conversation."
Yeah.
I was like, "Can we talk about it?" He's like, "No."
This is what it is.
He said, "The board and I met. Check your email.
We've already talked about this.
You got some new paperwork to sign." So that's actually how it happened, which I think is a really good comparison to like.
It's almost like instead of just marrying someone, you were friends for a while, then you dated, and those marriages normally end up a lot better.
But it's almost like when someone sees you, it's like, hey, you didn't go from realtor to like internet personality.
Yeah.
Right. It was a process. Like you tried this, you tried that. It's like for you to say like, hey, you're exit a tech founder to CEO of a public company. Those 2.5 years in the middle.
It's really a process. Yeah.
And it was not like
it wasn't like I want to go be this.
Because if in the first conversation was like, dude, I've never had a job. I don't want a job. He's like, good. I don't want.
Not looking for employees.
He's like, this works because I have plenty of employees. Like, come help me with this stuff. And he's like, I won't tell you what to do. I just go fix this stuff, and it'll work. And I was like, okay. And then it was like, hey, why don't you do this other thing? And then, but and I think it was actually a better way to become CEO because I feel like you as a sample size of one, you guys got to know me a lot better. It wasn't like, hey, this stranger showed up out of nowhere and he's the boss now. It was funny that Sunday when Glenn called me and I said, what changed? And other than like the obvious. And he laughed and he said, hey, I did a town hall with like 400 agents about this thing. And during Q&A, the only thing they want to talk about is when you were going to become CEO. So it's pretty apparent that the time is right now. And again, kudos to him to like, I think some leaders would be threatened by that versus Glenn's like, I'm ready, you're ready, the agents are ready, let's do it.
Was that his first time? Did he give the CEO to somebody and then come back?
Jason, he was with us for quite a while.
That's right, yeah. So I think he's been trying to figure out how to put somebody in that spot for a minute, looking for the right person. He's great.
Yeah.
I love Glenn. Speaking about companies losing money and stuff, that's not something we do.
No, look, I think one of the most defensible value propositions we have is we're sustainable, right? So, Glenn really created an entire category in the cloud-based brokerage. I feel like every new company will look more like us than the legacy players, right? If you see any national company who's come up in the last 5 years,
right,
who's scaling, looks a lot more like us, right? Yeah. So the margin availability while still providing value to agents is almost virtually impossible with the brick and mortar. And so we've managed to create a model where it's 100% agent-centric, which is what I spend every waking moment of the day on, is how do I make your guys' tool set better, how do I make the platform better, how do I give you more reach, how do I give you products for less than you can get them on your own. But maintaining profitability or the ability to, obviously we've had rough quarters, we had to pay a little bit of money in the settlement, that kind of stuff, where as long as there are no surprises,
just a tiny,
we can maintain a profitable business, and profitability becomes really valuable because you can then invest. You can buy companies that make sense. You can hire talent, right? Like one of the things that I say that's amazing about our company is that we have a deep bench of talented real estate experts. It's not a one-man band, whether it's me or Glenn, right? We have Wendy and we have Holly and we have Brian and we have all these folks who come from very storied careers, and more importantly, they all started as agents, right? So we have a unique leadership team that has big corporate experience, but we all sold homes at some point, which I think makes it very different. We didn't come from Apple or Google.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I've heard either you say it or somebody said it, that you were the only CEO of a publicly traded brokerage who actually sold real estate.
I did say that.
Yeah.
So of the current landscape of publicly traded brokerages, and I'm always happy to correct myself if I get new information, but and I've said it several times, that of the publicly traded companies today available to view, I'm the only one who actually sold homes.
Yeah, I used to talk about EXP like they're Apple. Apple isn't worth $2 trillion over, or what are they worth, $3 trillion now?
Probably.
Yeah, they're not worth trillions because of the iPhone. They're worth trillions because of a couple of products, and then they bought a bunch of different companies, right? And I look at what EXP is doing, and with all their cash and their profit and their investments and companies they buy, And I'm like, this is the juggernaut of the real estate world.
And that's again, like when you create a category.
When you talk about from the business standpoint, P&Ls, profitability, from the business world, it's like it's the juggernaut.
No, and that's that. And I think about it that way in the sense we created a category, and that's when I compare us to like Amazon, right? Amazon disrupted retail. Netflix disrupted not only Blockbuster, but almost how content's created and consumed. What both those companies can do, because they have free cash flow, is then buy, whether it's like we've just bought Lux VT, right? That purveyor of luxury services. We first partnered with them, dated, and it worked really well, and so we acquired it, right? So it's like, if we see something, we have the ability at a size of scale to go, oh, that's really cool. First of all, if I feel like copying a feature, I will, because you've copied my entire business models. So I have no qualms with it. Like, hey, if that makes sense, and that makes, I'm gonna just acquire it, or we'll build it in-house. But in order to be able to do that, you have to have a sustainable business model, right? There are many companies in real estate right now, and I'm only gonna kind of point at the publicly traded ones, because those are the only ones I can see the financials, who have very little cash on hand, right? And with little cash on hand or a profitable cash flow model, it is hard to make investments, whether it's acquiring adjacent businesses or complementary businesses, hiring talent, and then also being able to weather a surprise, right? Like what I do know is in the next 24 months, a once-in-a-lifetime event will probably take place, because ever since you and I graduated high school, we've lived through one just about every 2 to 5 years. That's the joke about our generation, where it's like we're kind of burnt out.
Yeah.
It's like
we're ready for
9/11. It's like from the day you and I graduated high school, we've lived through a once-in-a-lifetime event.
Here's my question. These other publicly traded brokerages, okay, the ones that lose money, they're not profitable, etc. You talked about Uber. They lost money for a long time. Now they're a profitable, sustainable business. What's the argument with some of these companies that, oh, well, we're an Uber type, we're an Amazon type, where, that's part of the thing is you lose money for a while, you build the platform, you build the business model, and then you become profitable.
So there's a couple of ways to become profitable. One is if you're losing money because you're investing in scale, right? You're trying to get to more. But one of the things that I look at, which I think is, and one is in software, gross margin is much bigger. And so if you look at our peer group, we enjoy a very healthy gross margin to net margin. So we tend to float between 6 to 8%. That's net of stock compensation and rev share and all the levers that we have to create the incentive for you guys to grow the company. A lot of other competitors, similar or legacy, their gross margin to cost of goods sold don't create excess capital, right? So some of them have only stayed in business because they continue to sell stock, which is a dilutive behavior, right? For every stock we issue, we try to buy back the exact same amount, roughly,
right,
depending on the month and quarter, to protect the integrity of the company. And so others who cannot create net cash flow don't buy back the same amount that they issue, which creates free cash flow, right? So there's cash flow, free cash flow, adjusted EBITDA, and then net income, right? We make money at all of them. Some only make money on adjusted EBITDA, which does not count stock compensation and stock issuance. So, there are more than one company in our space. The only reason they don't run out of cash is because they're selling stock, right? Which, again, it's a short-term solution.
Are they selling stock and raising money from venture capitalists?
Well, there's many ways you could issue stock and sell it to investors, or you could sell it into the open market.
Yeah,
like
same thing.
It's different than a debt issuance, right? Like a company who raises $100 million, $300 million of debt, or a stock block. But kind of in the normal course, there's stock issuance, and like we issue stock to incentivize certain behaviors from you guys when you attract, when you cap, when you hit icon. But we go back into the market and buy it all back, right? So if I give you 16K because you iconed, I then go buy that stock back.
Yeah. I guess I guess I'm not as big of a visionary as some of these agents who are willing to join a company that loses a lot of money. I can't wrap my head around it. Going to a company that's publicly traded that loses a lot of money, and all the thing I can think of is that either they just don't look at it and they don't care and they're not even paying attention to it, or they're like, no, companies lose money for a while and then they do really well. You know, I can't wrap my head around it.
So I have conversations with agents all the time. I said, first of all, like, I truly believe the agent is the brand. Like, I don't believe that companies make
100%.
Well, there's some
100%.
companies that kind of don't agree with our philosophy, right? So some agents are attracted to the brand because of what it says about them in the marketplace.
Yeah.
So maybe that's where some of that logic comes from. It's like, hey, I'm not really worried about what their finances are because I sell a certain price point, so I want to be seen to be wearing this brand.
Yeah.
Versus other people are picking to kind of build a potential revenue stream, and like, for example, RevShare with us or one of our similar models. The question I ask them is like, look, if you're just picking a brand and at the end of the day you don't care if they last forever because you're not building anything on top of that, then, you know, it could work for now and that doesn't bother you if in 5 years, 10 years they don't exist. But if you're actually going to invest time and energy into building a revenue stream, RevShare is very different than any form of entrepreneurship. So, Ricky, whether you're selling houses or you're building your coaching products or any products you create, those rise and fall with Ricky's ability to operate. Like, nothing that Leo or EXP does affects Ricky. Now, your one revenue income stream with us, it actually completely, it's like 80% my responsibility, right? Like, you can get them to the dance and you can get them excited and you can get them to sign the ICA, but when they get here, your ability to earn is almost entirely my responsibility, from onboarding them to paying them to answering their broker questions. And more importantly, is that, like, if you invest 3, 5, 10 years and that becomes tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue to you, if one day I'm like, we didn't do good math, I could have changed it all.
Right.
You could have had 5, 7 years of time and energy invested get wiped out.
Right. Which, I see where you're going with this. Some of these other companies that are like, free everything, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. It's not going to be like that forever. It can't. It's not sustainable.
Like, I like a sentence where I say sustainability equals legacy.
I like that. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you, bro.